We're going to try to cover a considerable amount of ground today. Rather than focusing on making one or 2 points solidly and comprehensively, we're instead going to focus on taking a full journey, hopefully from 0 to 100. And so I might not give full evidence for everything I say, but I'm going to try to cover everything and just move through our entire tradition to honor Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. That's going to be our offering today. And good theology is equal parts science and philosophy on one side and art and drama on the other. And I'm going to try to walk a fine line and razor's edge between those two. So there you go. I guess we can start with where all good theology needs to start, with the miracle of life, and specifically with the miracle of consciousness. Consciousness is an indisputable world which is entirely dependent on consciousness for perception. All objective truths, which are third-party verifiable and you can give evidence for, are dependent primarily on consciousness in order for those proofs to be appreciated. But consciousness itself is irreducibly subjective. I experience consciousness, therefore I know I'm conscious. It's impossible for me to experience the consciousness of another person. Sometimes you have collective consciousness, where 2 people or more agree on something that they share together, but that collective consciousness is always dependent on individual consciousness, therefore it's always derivative and secondary. And the primary thing is your individual experience of the world. And it's fundamentally subjective. It can never be verified through third-party evidence. I can analogously think that you must be conscious because you respond to stimuli in the same way I do. But theoretically, you could be a philosophical zombie. You could be someone who responds to stimuli in a normative way, but is actually devoid of consciousness. We have a small example of this in sociopaths who are devoid of empathy, although oftentimes behaving as if they do have empathy. But we know that there are people in the world who have a limited capacity for empathy, or in fact, no capacity for empathy. It's bizarre to think about, but they learn how to respond to stimuli in the same way people who are possessed of empathy respond. But in fact, it's trained or learned behavior, and there's no light going on. There's no empathetic light going on in their mind. Similarly, it is reasonable for practically every philosopher on the planet to argue that people could all be responding to stimuli the way you do, but not necessarily be conscious the same way that you are. And therefore our gifting to other people, our assumption that other people are conscious like we are, is based on analogy and not on empirical evidence. This of course demonstrates that there are things that exist in this world that go beyond what empirical science can teach. And in fact, some of the most primary parts of existence go beyond what empirical science can teach. The irreducibility of consciousness, the quantum nature of consciousness, the ontological basicness of consciousness is profound and worthy of meditating on and worthy of contemplating. And in fact, all good things come from it. If you tell people to believe your scripture, then somebody else can say, well, believe my sacred text, or just accept what I say unquestionably. And you get into this world where people argue for authority, but they can't actually provide you with a logical means to get to their destination, other than to just blindly accept what they say. The solution for that is to start humbly with your own experience of the world and to extrapolate and abstract from that methodically and carefully. All good spiritual science, all good theology stands on this ground. And so starting with consciousness, we can notice the irreducibility of it, the subjective nature of it, things like free will and thought, which chemicals simply do not possess. And we can question the narrative that physics gives rise to chemistry, and chemistry gives rise to biology, and biology gives rise to consciousness. Because we can notice that consciousness must have been there from the beginning, because it's irreducible and therefore cannot be derivative. That leads you to the conclusion that the singularity, and there's excellent evidence that the universe came from a singularity as it's expanding outwards, and there's tons of evidence to support that. It leads you to the conclusion that the singularity that gave rise to the universe must have been conscious. And a conscious singularity that gave rise to everything else is, generally speaking, known as God. That's a decent definition for God. Once you accept that there is a conscious source of all reality, you're now squarely in the realm of theology. You're doing philosophy, and God is part of the discussion. Just as within quantum physics, fundamental particles and fundamental forces are assumed as always and perennially existing, and you work from there forward, and if you're able to work from your premises and your axioms forward, you've done an excellent job as a scientist. Similarly, if you can reasonably introduce the concept of God and then work forward from that, you've been just as intellectually astute and just as intellectually respectable. And so we're at a conscious singularity. The next question becomes, what's the nature of that conscious singularity? And the question after that becomes, who am I and what's my relationship with that conscious singularity? And in fact, these discussions, the nature of the world, the nature of self, the nature of deity, and the interrelationships between those three primary features of reality is what every tradition does. So again, once we arrive at the idea that there is a conscious source of all existence, and of course consciousness is always personal and individual. And that's another really subversive notion to really contemplate. If we say that God is the conscious source of all existence, we're really saying God's a person. It doesn't necessarily mean God has a material body like you do. That would be anthropomorphic to assume that because you have a material body, all conscious beings must possess material bodies. But it would mean that God would have to possess at least some spiritual form, some spiritual attributes, and the ability to interact with his creation, because you have that ability and you came from that deity. Consciousness is always individual. Collective consciousness is always secondary. To postulate that God is collective consciousness still means he would be dependent on individual consciousness for his existence, just as all collective consciousness is dependent on individual consciousness for its existence, like I mentioned before. And so now you start to think about what that personal, individually conscious, willful, possessed of free will, powerful, all-powerful being, because he created the universe, is like. And there's a few things we can get to relatively quickly. Again, these aren't full arguments, but they at least are tight, and they at least are reasonable, and at least gives us we can at least cut in and move forward. If you're all-powerful, and the source of all existence would be all-powerful, because it created all the laws that everyone else and everything else is subjected to. Of course, just looking at the nature of this world is profound, because this world is logical and reasonable, and you can look at, I don't know, electromagnetism and strong and weak nuclear force and neutrinos and then neutrons and atoms and molecules, and you can see that they behave in regular ways. And in fact, those regular ways they behave in can be anticipated and they can be projected. And you can reasonably look at fundamental particles and fundamental forces, and you can extrapolate what's necessarily going to happen, because the universe moves logically and systematically in a regular fashion. That, of course, would mean that the Creator was logical as opposed to chaotic. Did you follow that? That's profound, worth contemplating, worth thinking about. That by looking at the nature of this creation, which is what you got to start with, all good philosophy starts with what's right in front of you. If you have a deductive logical syllogism, the famous one of which is that Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man. It's a major premise and a minor premise. All men are mortal. Socrates is an instance of that major premise. He's a man, and therefore he's mortal. And you take out the common clause, which is mortality. Man. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. You take out the common clause, which is men and man, and you're left with Socrates as mortal, just like in algebra. That logical, deductive syllogism is entirely dependent on inference. You look at the world and you notice that people die. And you notice that everybody dies. And after you see enough people dying, you can then decide, hey, everybody dies. And if you're a person, then you're going to die too. All deductive logic is dependent on inferential logic for its existence. It's just when you have enough inferential logic, a drop of water is salty, therefore the ocean is salty, eventually you can conclude, hey, the ocean is salty, therefore every drop of water that comes from it must be salty. But it always starts with your first experience of reality, and then you working carefully and thinking about it carefully. Do you guys follow that? So, we look at the creation, we see the creation as logical and follows regular patterns that are predictable. And we can now understand that that creator, that must have been conscious, that singularity that gave rise to the universe, must also be logical and reasonable. And now we live in a logical, reasonable world instead of a chaotic one. There's a lot of benefit to living in a reasonable world and not assuming that the deity is chaotic and whimsical and wanton and arbitrary. There's a lot of benefit to that. That's why in the book of John, in the New Testament, it says in the beginning was Logos, and Logos was Theos. They were making a very, very important philosophical point that the deity is logical and reasonable. And it's good to live in such a world, and there's great evidence, namely the world, the child of God, to support the idea that the deity is logical and reasonable. Anyway, so now we have a logical deity, and that deity gave rise to everything else. He's all-powerful. And now we can start to think about what it means to be all-powerful. If you're all-powerful, you're omniscient. Because intelligence is a type of power. Knowledge is a type of power. And therefore an all-powerful being would automatically be omniscient. There's a couple of ways to get to God being all good. I'm going to choose a real simple one. Evil is not like choosing to go right instead of left or to zig instead of zag. Rather, evil is weakness, the inability to do the right thing. And if there's nothing stopping you from doing the right thing, no weakness that makes it impossible for you to do the right thing, then you would do the right thing. Therefore, goodness is the default position, provided you have sufficient power to be good and you're not suffering from any weakness. An all-powerful being would therefore be all good because there's nothing stopping him from being good. And now we have a logical, all good, all-knowing being that is the source of all creation. Once you get to that personal, individual, loving, knowing, powerful deity, you can really start to paint a picture. It's almost as if you want to paint a picture and the first thing you have to do is acquire paint and a canvas and brushes. And the canvas that theologians want to paint on has these paints available to them. An all good, all powerful, all knowing singularity that's logical and is the source of all subsequent reality. And here's where the magic happens. When you can put the brush to the canvas, when you can put paint on the canvas, when you can put ink to paper and you can start to write something, write poetry. To understand Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Shruti Prabhu and I have this running joke. He quotes, I have a few haters that I've attracted over the decades. Like all controversial, outspoken people, I have a few haters. I'm also a faulty individual, so that contributes to my hater fandom. My fan club of haters. Anyway, somebody was criticizing me. This is many years ago. I still regularly get criticism. I'll probably get criticized for this class as well. Especially if some of you appreciate it. I've noticed that when people really appreciate my classes, then Krishna always sends a hater to equal it out on the other side. And it seems like it's the best class I ever heard, and I'll hear from somebody else 5 minutes later, it's the worst class I ever heard. Shruti Prabhu and I have a running joke that somebody came to him one time and said, oh, Tukaram's class was awful. It was Gaura Purnima, and he talked the whole time about Radha and Krishna. And Shruti Prabhu says, he laughed at this person in their face and said, but that's what Krishnadas Kaviraj does in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. He said, if you want to understand Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, you have to understand Radha and Krishna. So what he was doing was exactly what our tradition does and precisely what our tradition does. So our core conception of God is Krishna. Krishna is ridiculously subversive and counterintuitive. Let me explain to you what I mean. A, Krishna's black. That's cool. That's super subversive as well. If you look at the history of the world, in many ways the history of the world, at least in modern times, has been the exploitation of darker colored people by lighter colored people. Some people like to say that race is a recent invention, but they just don't know history. Go back to Egypt, and you can see they had 4 different colors of people. And they had the lighter-skinned people ruling the darker-skinned people. And there were some Saharan Egyptian pharaohs, but they were few and far between. And if you look at the hieroglyphs and you look at the paintings on the walls, you will see racial bias existing even back then. Krishna's black. In fact, the word Krishna means black. We say the word Krishna means the all-attractive one. That's a secondary definition. The primary definition of the word Krishna in any Indic language, as well as in Sanskrit, the primal Indian language, is black. You get out an etymological dictionary, a Sanskrit dictionary, an old Sanskrit dictionary, an Amar Kosh, and you'll see that the primary meaning of Krishna is black. That's subversive. Krishna is also not just male. Krishna is Radha and Krishna. Krishna is feminine and masculine. That's also subversive. Krishna is a child. That one is just, practically speaking, if you really think about it, should make you feel like you fell out of a tree and got concussed. We worship God as a child, which just seems, I don't know, pre-philosophical. Seems like we're some sort of pre-philosophical tradition. Yeah, some sort of animism tradition or something like that. But worshiping God as a child is extraordinarily brilliant. When you think of God as your father and mother, both of which Krishna claims in the Gita, Pitaham Asya Jagato Mata, I'm the mother and father of the universe. And so the Vedic text is the oldest text in the world that envisioned a monotheistic first deity as being both masculine and feminine. Technically a monolatristic deity as being both masculine and feminine. A highest deity, not exclusive deity where there's no other deities, but a highest deity, an original deity, as being both masculine and feminine. You find God referred to in both masculine and feminine language in the oldest Vedic text, the Rig Veda. Thinking of God as a child is so counterintuitive precisely because we're used to asking God for stuff almost exclusively. Even when we want to be grateful, it's like, Thank you for what you've given me. I mean, the nature of gratitude is always based on you got more than what you deserved in the bargain, and therefore you're thankful. So gratitude, although it's a healthy human emotion that we should all cultivate, according to Cicero, it's the parent of all other virtues. Gratitude is always based on I got more than I deserved from you, and therefore I'm grateful to you for having been uncommonly kind and generous with me. Therefore, gratitude is always built on a parental type relationship, either patriarchal or matriarchal, which is why everybody refers to God as your mother or your father. We even do too. When we're giving people a grade school education, we give people this classical conception of God. But Krishna is a much higher level, collegiate level conception of divinity, where you've stopped asking for anything and you just want to give. Where you stopped asking for anything and you just want to give. If you just want to give, and you got to start from what's in this world when you're extrapolating and thinking about that world, because that's how good philosophy is done, where it's not arbitrary and just based on some text you have to have blind adherence to. What relationship in this world involves giving unconditionally, without question?
Mother and child.
That's right. And you're the mother, and Krishna becomes your child. So worshiping God as a child is the only conclusion a tradition which values selfless and unconditional love can come to. It's the only model that properly expresses that ideal. Do you guys follow that? Like, my mind is blown. I'm saying it, and I'm hearing myself say it, and I'm like, whoa, that's powerful. I need to take a second. That idea is mind-blowingly gorgeous and beautiful and worthy of the rest of your life in fidelity. Whoever came up with that idea is just like the most brilliant person in the history of humanity. The idea is so beautiful that it's practically speaking revelatory. It goes beyond what somebody could have figured out, and it must have been divinely descending. And it's logical and reasonable to boot. Now you've got this all-good, all-powerful, logical, omniscient, personal deity that's the source of all reality. And we can start to think about how we want to relate to that deity. I skipped over a concept of self, sparks unto a flame, a ray of light under the sun, an instance of God's identity, a small fraction, a part and parcel of divinity, literally in our tradition, a vibhina angsa, a separated part of God, dependent on but of the same nature as divinity, not the source of all creation, but definitely comprised of light, fundamentally good, fundamentally pure, uncontaminatable, a pure soul theology. And how should we, as those pure souls, relate to divinity? We should relate to God as being not just a white male landowner in the sky who's smiting or smoting people based on fear, but we should look for an inclusive conception of divinity that sees the best in everything. For instance, if we try to divide the world by what's called the principle of invidious contrast into active and passive, good and evil, which is a fundamental dualism and goes against the principle that everything came from a singularity. It's convenient to divide the world into good and evil, right and wrong, heaven and hell, Jews and Goyim, Christians and heathens, Muslims and infidels. It's convenient because you kind of get to throw everything away that doesn't fit with your model. You just got to blame somebody else for it. But if you have the belief in the singularity that gave rise to all creation, you have to find a way to include everything in existence as being housed by and derivative of that all-good, all-powerful personal deity. And so that means you have to look at the world a little more carefully. And you have to look at contrasts, polarities, such as active and passive, absolute and relative. Let's go with absolute and relative, and active and passive. Are there positive ways to be passive? Yes. Words like receptivity denote that. Are there positive ways to be relative? We always define God as being absolute. But in fact, love depends on vulnerability and relativity. Therefore, a deity that was absolute would be incapable of love. Empathy depends on relativity, being receptive to and responsive to another person's feeling, putting yourself in their shoes, taking a secondary position and following their lead. A deity that was absolute, absolutely absolute, would be incapable of feeling empathy as well. And at best, you're dealing with a robotic automaton for a deity, following logical rules, as opposed to that all-loving deity that we established previously. Therefore, a full conception of divinity would have to include a deity that was both absolute and relative in the best of possible ways, capable of love, and at the same time the active source of all reality. Now you've got a child who's capable of receiving your love, who's capable of receiving your intimate love. Formal love is weak at best, a poor stand-in for intimate love. Intimate love is where it's at. Close, intimate love. Intimate love depends on equality, which means for intimate love between the soul and God to exist, we'd have to have a place, a platform, where everything was equalized and there wasn't this massive hegemony between us and the deity. A fear-based relationship is just like not even on offer. Fear versus love, we got to choose love. Formal love versus intimate love, we got to choose intimate love. Intimate love requires equality, but how can there be equality between us and God? Because God is the source of all reality. He's the most fundamentally different being from us that could possibly exist, because he's all powerful and we're not. Because he's the source of everything and we're not. To compare us to an ant and God to a human being is just a horribly inaccurate, inadequate comparison, because the truth is so much more, millions and billions times infinity over of difference. We're infinitesimal. We're infinitely small. He's infinite. Ants and human beings aren't infinite and infinitesimal. You can easily figure out the cells of your body compared to your body, whatever there's 30 billion cells in your body, whatever the number is. I forgot whether it's an M or a B. It's a pretty big distinction. I'm going to have to Google that after class. Trillion, it could be trillion. I might even be off there. Somewhere between, it's definitely not million. It's definitely got to be billion or trillion. Anyway, we're going to go with one. It's a B or T. I'm not going to worry about it any further. Don't bother Googling it. It'll just annoy me. The comparison fails. God's infinite, we're infinitesimal. How could we possibly have intimate love with the deity? Well, we just have to forget that Krishna was God. In fact, that's our conception of heaven. There's a place at the zenith of existence where devotees, where angels forget Krishna's God, and they think of him as their child, their friend, or their lover, and they disport themselves on equal terms with the deity and relish divine intimate love, which is available to everybody in the world for the price of a song. It's always there, always available, because all good God would create a world, would want to create a world where that love was always an option for you. And all-powerful God could create such a world. Of course, love depends on free will, and therefore you have to choose it. And that's our synergistic responsibility in the completion of bhakti. And so, just from looking at the beauty of consciousness, we get to God, we get to an all-good, all-powerful God, we get to a pure soul. Also, an all-good, all-powerful God would create pure souls, would not create a fractured soul that was broken. we get to free will, and we get to the most beautiful conception of divinity that could exist, namely an intimate, loving relationship where everybody forgot that God was God and they disported themselves on equal terms and engaged in a divine, rapturous play of love. And that is precisely and exactly what Vrindavan is in our tradition, what Braj Bhakti is in our tradition. It's precisely how we worship Krishna and have for thousands of years. As far as I'm concerned, that's it. I don't need anything else. That information I just shared with you guys was enough for me to just opt in fully and make this my life's work. 35 years later, having spent my entire adult lifehood pursuing Krishna consciousness, good save, brother. Well done. She was wearing shoes. Good eye. 35 years later, having spent my adult life kind of flailing around like an idiot, but on the path, earnestly and doggedly pursuing Krishna, I couldn't be happier. I feel blessed to have encountered such a wonderful conception of divinity. And really, I mean, if I'm not just being willfully petty, I could die right now and my life is entirely complete. I don't need anything else. I'm good. Somebody gave me that. It's enough. Don't need anything else. In fact, to say anything else is like an insult to the beauty of the tradition I've inherited. It's like that conception of divinity is enough for me forever. And I even feel like I'm not glorifying it enough to say it's enough for me forever. It really doesn't do justice to how miraculous that feels to my life. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is more than that. Our tradition says, if you want to get truly bewildered, become a master logician and then think about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and you still won't be able to figure it out. It goes beyond all logic. And so this Krishna conception of divinity is it's just such like a profound theology that I almost just want to invite people to study comparative theology, because once you study comparative theology, then you can really appreciate what we're doing. You know what I mean? Like, go become a professional basketball player, then you can appreciate Michael Jordan. Go become a professional boxer, then you can appreciate Floyd Mayweather. You don't even have a right, like you don't even get it. You have to go and actually get to a pro level, a high pro level, then you can truly appreciate their genius. Go and study comparative theology. Go and do everything under the sun and come back and talk to me like in 1,000 lifetimes. And then we can sit together and we can really get into it about how beautiful these ideas are. How complete they are. How earth-shatteringly gorgeous they are. How worthy of devotion they are. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was more. Alfred North Whitehead is an extremely, extremely famous Western philosopher. He came up with something called process theory. One of his disciples, Charles Hartshorne, also an extremely influential philosopher. He came up with something called process theology. Both of them borrowed from the work of Jiva Goswami, one of our theologians from 5 centuries ago. We know that because they footnote their work. Hartshorne did, at least. He footnoted his work and gave credit to Jiva Goswami and his Satsandarbhas, our core texts, which frame out our tradition comprehensively, that were where tradition was codified 5 centuries ago in a comprehensive way. Hartshorne articulated this idea that infinity must include growth, and a complete conception of God not only would have to include vulnerability and passivity and relativity. He made these points. But it would also have to include, our tradition made them before him, but he made these points in Western philosophy. He introduced these points to Western philosophy. But it would also have to include growth. There's another one of those ideas that's just like, you just spend the rest of your life thinking about that. That true perfection would include both infinity and growth. Growth within infinity. An ever-growing but infinite deity. A God in development. A God always undergoing radical growth. Perfection means not stasis, as most of us think, but rather it necessitates growth. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was Krishna in growth. To understand this, we have to actually go all the way back to Indian dramaturgy, which is entirely distinct from Western dramaturgy in that instead of following a plot-based model, it follows a rasa-based model. The plot-driven model, the hero's journey, is why in every Disney movie you've ever watched that your children are watching, somehow or other the heroes almost die, some sort of awful death. It's actually like bizarre. We have these Disney movies and like whatever, I don't know who we're talking about. We're talking about like Aurora or I'm drawing a blank. Give me something. Aladdin, Aurora, Pocahontas, Jasmine. I'm thinking of all my daughter's favorite princesses that she plays with. Snow White. I think they actually got rid of Snow White. It was like a racial thing. They got rid of Snow White. It's like, let's park you. But all these Disney cartoons, everybody's about to die all the time. You ever notice that? It's a plot-based model. You got to like bring people to the edge of death because then you feel vicariously like satisfied. You feel like you went through growth along with the people you identified with vicariously through the movie. The rasa-based model is based on the same thing that's vicarious. It's based on the same thing. But it has a much different revelation. Rasa is based on the idea of Vishai and Ashrai. To put it simply, love exists between two people and binds them together. There must be a lover and there must be a beloved. The quality of the love that the lover feels is based on the personal attributes of the beloved. The more personal attributes the beloved has, the more rich the experience of love that the lover has. And there's two things going on in a loving relationship. I love you, you love me back. I'm the lover, you're the beloved, you're also the lover, and I'm the beloved. And we each experience love based on the personal qualities of the other one. Because God's infinite and filled with infinite divine qualities, and there's a singularity in that sense. The capacity the devotee has to feel love for Krishna is entirely unlimited. In contrast, Krishna's capacity to love is limited by our finitude, by our infinitesimалness, by the finitude of reality, in comparison to the infinitude of the deity. And Krishna, just like you can't create a square circle, and a deity that can't create a square circle is not deficient in any way, just as a deity that can't create gobbledygook, which doesn't exist, isn't deficient in any way, because that thing doesn't actually exist. Therefore, a logical deity, a deity that was logic personified, could not reasonably experience love of himself in the same way we do, because you have to be in an opposite position as a lover and not the beloved in order to experience the magic and the union of love. Love, therefore, is forever dependent on there being two in order for it to make the two one. And the universe where individuality disintegrated at any point would be a universe where at that precise moment, love also disintegrated. That's not one of those points you can spend the rest of your life thinking about and never come to the limit of. And our dramaturgists were also theologians. And so they weren't just writing the rules for drama. They were writing the rules of reality. Because good drama mimics reality on a stage where you can experience it like vibrantly and almost like in a more focused way. Just like art, like a painting of a beautiful sunset, is special because it highlights certain elements that are there in the original sunset, which is always going to be more beautiful and more profound. But somehow the artist is able to just encapsulate certain features in a way that you can relate to more, almost following a Shaka Chandra Nyaya, or the logic of the branch and the moon. You want to see the moon, and somebody says, look at the moon where's the moon? I can't find it in the sky. It's a full moon nighttime. Where's the moon in the sky? Oh, it's between the branches of the tree. It's not. But you're on the ground. And that gives you a reference point. And so amazing art, amazing drama, by being of this world and close to you, becomes an analogy for reality that allows you to more deeply enter into it by focusing on certain elements, which then allows you to better appreciate the larger world that you're trying to fathom, which is so infinite that you wouldn't be able to find your bearings. But when you look between the branches of a tree, all of a sudden you can start to see where's the moon and point it out to somebody else and appreciate it. Good art, being of this world and closer to you, allows the artist to better express something of the magic of reality and the cosmos that he's trying to encapsulate. Not even encapsulate, he's trying to honor. She's trying to honor. That made sense because I listen to myself while I talk. I'm cool like that. But it's the first time I ever said it. And even I had a difficult time following it. But it did make sense and I want to move on. So I'm going to move on. Yeah, I'm going to say it one more time. Good art is close to you and it's trying to help you better appreciate the entirety of reality, which is beyond your ability to just focus in on because it's too broad and you're too small. And so good art takes some of the beautiful aspects of that larger reality and puts them on a canvas right in front of you and highlights and honoring things. And thereby gives you an analogy, gives you a metaphor, gives you something close to you that you can then use to see something further away that you wouldn't be able to get your bearings on otherwise. Therefore, art imitates life. And so the dramaturgists that made the rules for making a good drama, they were also theologians. And they were trying to help people to capture some of the beauty of reality within drama, and drama was religious. In fact, our major theologians wrote plays to express the highest principles of reality. When they wanted to really express the highest things our tradition teaches, they did not do it by writing rigorous texts. They also did that as an introduction. But when they really wanted to explore it, they wrote dramas that are actually performed to this day. And when I say they wrote dramas, I mean they had a cast and costumes and sets. And then people would put on the plays. And the audience would be all serious savants and saints of our tradition. They would be in the audience. Serious practitioners of our tradition. And then the people doing the play would also be serious practitioners. And the entire room would be just filled with tears of ecstasy. As people just left this world on a bridge to transcendence, that were the sacred writings of our tradition, that were poetry. That's why you read Shakespeare to understand love, instead of a science book. And those dramas became a bridge to beyond. And through those dramas, people were able to experience something beyond themselves. And the whole thing was founded on this principle of the lover and the beloved, and of the depth of love being based on the qualities of the beloved. And of Krishna, therefore, being in a deficit. And Krishna one day was walking through a palatial garden and caught his reflection in a jeweled column and became stunned. Krishna's Madan Mohan. He's the Cupid of Cupid. Madan is Cupid. Mud means mad. It also means sweet. In this context, it means maddened. And you become maddened by Cupid. Cupid makes you go mad. And so Madan Mohan is the person who's so beautiful and so seductive and so intriguing that Cupid goes crazy for Krishna. And Krishna's walking down the road in heaven and caught his reflection in a jeweled column and was stunned. And was just, who is that person? He just wanted to dive into that person and embrace that person. And then he realized, oh my God, it's me. And he thought, what must my devotees be feeling? They get to catch my reflection and never let go of it. And Krishna thought, I want to know what that would be like. And Krishna became greedy, lusty, desirous. This is the language of our tradition to explore this point. We take all those terms back. And we don't let them be used by the materialists. And he became intensely desirous of trying to understand what it would be like to fall in love with himself. But that's impossible. Because he's the object of love. He's not the lover of himself. But that desire of an omnipotent deity must come to fruition. And that desire coming to fruition is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Krishna, enveloped and protected by the love of Radharani, therefore his blackish form has become golden. And Krishna gets to experience what it's like to love Krishna in the mood of Radharani. Radha bhava jyuti suvalitam nomi Krishna swarupam. That Krishna became adorned with the bhav of Radharani, and his blackish complexion became golden. And then he performed Ras Leela in front of the whole world, because as Krishna fulfills his most personal, selfish desire to explore the love of Srimati Radharani for himself, because he is the oversoul and supersoul of the universe, he also performs the most munificent act and makes that love available to all of us, just as when someone is eating a feast and everyone gathers around them, then they share that feast with those people who happen to be there at that moment. And so at this moment in creation, Krishna did such a miraculous thing, and everyone surrounding him was able to do it too. And the Ras Leela, the intimate dance of love that goes on in Golok Vrindavan, became Harinam Sankirtan, available to all. Everyone could sing and dance together. Caste disappeared, race disappeared, sex disappeared, judgment disappeared, and everyone was invited to that dance where Krishna was still the center of attraction, but he was falling in love with himself in the mood of Radharani while Radharani watched and gave him pointers. That's Gadadhar Pandit. And he did the most private, intimate, esoteric thing in full display of the public in the Kali Yuga where we need it the most. And that became the Sankirtan movement, and that's what we strive for when we chant Hare Krishna Kirtan. Mahaprabhu was drunk on divine love. We take that term back too. Actually, madan also means liquor because it makes you go mad. And so Krishna is drunk on this wine of the holy name of divine love, of this Prem Nam Sankirtan, where people are crying out Krishna's name. And all good deity would want to make your spiritual life as easy as possible, and all powerful deity could. It would have to be synergistic, and you still have to be able to use your free will, and therefore enter bhakti and kirtan, where all you have to do is cry out to Krishna with full sincerity, and that's enough. That completes the circuit and awakens divine love within you. And real, profound bhakti traditions are comprised of this extremely simple kirtan, where you just get together with other people and you cry out to Krishna like a child for its mother, or like a mother for its child. With great love, with a full investment from your side. And that's enough. That completes the circuit and makes miracles happen and awakens divine love within you and completes your life and makes your life perfect. And there's a full deluge of grace that comes from that simple willingness on your part. Because love has to be freely given, therefore we do our part, and our part is that kirtan. And that kirtan is the Ras Leela from Golok Vrindavan, made into a form which is enterable by everyone, which is doable by everyone. And whereas the Ras Leela was the most private event in the entire cosmos, Harinam Sankirtan is the most inclusive event in the entire cosmos. And as Krishna dances as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in that kirtan, which he does do, when devotees do kirtan purely, they witness Krishna's descension and they experience it. They can see Mahaprabhu dance. And he dances, but he's drinking that divine love. And it's falling out of his mouth because you can't drink and dance at the same time. And those drops of nectar falling from his mouth while he drinks and dances and chants, which is an impossibility, fall on the ground. And anybody gathered around to participate gets to experience it. And one drop of that nectar can drown the whole universe in ecstatic love. And that's what we're doing with Kirtan. Okay? And without further ado, let's do a little kirtan. Gaura Purnima. Hari Hari Bol.